Shooting in auto mode is a bit like throwing a bucket of paint at a canvas. Yes, it might be painting, but shooting in manual mode or semi-manual mode is like delicately painting in these fine brush strokes to give you that absolutely perfect end result. When I go to take a photograph, I already have the exact idea of what I want in my head. Now all I need to do is translate that from my head to the camera. Now when I'm shooting in auto mode, there is no possible way that the camera knows what I'm looking at or what I'm looking for. So how could it possibly get the image I want? Well, it can't. A photograph has two basic parameters. And yes, I'm keeping it simple for now. The first is your aperture, also called your f-stop, which is the storyteller of your scene. It's your creative tool to help show or guide that viewer or the person viewing your photograph to exactly the point you want them to see. It helps highlight your subject. This should always be one of the first things you set in your camera. The aperture dictates how much of your image will be in focus. Your aperture is measured in f-stops, like f1.8 or f11. Think of the f as standing for focus. So the larger the f number, the more of your image will be in focus. This photograph, for example, was shot at f1.8. And this photograph was shot at f11. Larger f number means more focus. The second part of your photograph is your shutter speed. This is very simple again, as it's basically just about how long the light actually shines on the sensor. A faster shutter speed means you're capturing the image incredibly quickly, so it will help to freeze any movement in your scene. A slower shutter speed then will capture the image more slowly, so it will create motion blur if there's any movement in your scene, of course. The little tip with shutter speed is the detail is in the name, shutter speed. So the faster your scene is, or the faster the movement in your scene, then the faster your shutter speed needs to be to capture that movement and to freeze that movement. So we stick to our plan and we start off with our first element first, which is our aperture. Then we adjust our shutter speed so our image is exposed correctly. So how do you know the image is exposed correctly? Well, a dark photograph means that your shutter speed was too fast. In other words, it didn't let enough light into the sensor so it could capture or expose the image properly. So if we use a slower shutter speed, it's going to make that image brighter. On the other hand then, a very bright or white image means that the shutter speed was too slow. There was too much light came in because the shutter was open for too long. So what we need to do there is increase our shutter speed so we get a correct exposure. Here we have our photograph. Now we have two models in the front, we have a microphone and we have the background. So what I want to do is, we're shooting here now at the moment at f2.8. So I'm going to increase the aperture. We're at f2.8 now. I'm going 3.2, 4, 4.5, 5, 5.6. As I'm increasing it, the picture is getting darker. So what we need to do now is we need to use a slower shutter speed. The slower shutter speed will enable enough light to come in so the image can actually be taken properly. So the light shines on the sensor for longer. Now, as you can see, our exposure overlay here is fractionally underexposed still. So there we go, that looks correct there now. If you look at the meter reading off here to the side, as I increase the shutter speed, you will see that the meter reading goes down to the negative. That's the positive. This is the 0, which is where we want to be. So as I slow down the shutter speed again, it goes back towards the 0, and that's roughly around right. Changing to f11 means our foreground, midground, and background are now all in focus. Now, to go from f11 back down to f5.6, you'll see the image is getting dramatically brighter. Now what we need to do is adjust our shutter speed again, and we need to make it faster because there's too much light coming in. You can see the meter reading is showing still, it's still fractionally overexposed. And there we go. To go below f5.6 again and to go down to f4, you'll see again it's getting brighter. So we need to make our shutter speed faster because again, it's overexposed. That's shortening the amount of time the light hits the sensor, so it makes it darker. So for me, a lot of the time when I'm shooting in manual mode, my shutter speed is what's helping to balance out my exposure. Now again, of course, shutter speed can be used for great creative effect too as well, with the likes of long exposure photography where you leave the shutter open for longer periods of time, 1 second, anything up to 10 minutes if you want, and you'll get this beautiful motion blur. Finally then, we come to the third element of your photograph. And yes, I know I said there was only two, but that was keeping it basic earlier on. There is a third element, and this is the third part of the exposure triangle, which is basically your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. ISO is basically a light amplifier that's built into your camera. The problem with light amplifiers is the more they amplify things, the more noise they create. So why would you use ISO then? Well, sometimes you simply have no other choice. If you're shooting in lower light conditions with fast moving subjects, then you need to be able to use a faster shutter speed. And the only way you can do that is to amplify the light that's coming in on the sensor. So you will need to use a higher ISO. Now I'm going to be having a separate video on ISO coming up soon where I'm going to go into a lot more detail on ISO, how it works, what exactly it does, and what's the best ISO for you and your camera going forward. What I recommend for now is to leave your ISO on its base ISO. Your base ISO is basically the lowest ISO on your camera, which is going to give you the cleanest image possible. Now, the one word of warning here is it's not always the lowest ISO on the camera. So please do get your camera model and give it a Google for your camera's base ISO. So the big issue with leaving your camera in auto ISO when you're starting off shooting in manual mode is, as you're getting used to these settings and as you're getting used to varying your shutter speed and your aperture and what effect it's going to have in your camera, your ISO could be increasing and decreasing steadily in the background. So you could take a photograph, but in the first photograph, your camera might have been on its base ISO of, let's say, ISO 100, and the second photograph, it might have jumped up to ISO 400. So it's making it a lot more sensitive to light, and as a result, your image is going to be a lot brighter. And when you look at the two of them in the back, you'll say, what happened there? Why was this one dark and this one so bright? This just doesn't make sense. Whereas when you're adjusting it manually yourself, you can see the settings take effect. Auto ISO definitely has its uses, and it is incredibly important in specific situations. And again, that's something I'm going to get into on my ISO video, so do stay tuned for that one. A little tip here though, if you have your first two settings set, so you have your aperture and your desired shutter speed, and you say, right, that image is still too dark. If it's very dark, what I would say is, then it's time to look at increasing your ISO. In other words, increasing the sensor's sensitivity to light, so it's going to brighten that image for you. This was just a rough overlook on the 3 different settings in your camera, or the 3 different aspects of the exposure triangle. I will be putting up separate videos on all 3 of these settings over the next couple of weeks, hopefully. So thanks again for watching, and see you out there.